Hello again. I don't know if you can tell from this video, but I've gotten a little sun. I was out there playing tennis today, doing extremely well against guys from the U.S. consulate. I beat them all. It was incredible. You need to know that it was a really good afternoon, but I'm excited to be here now talking about narrative theory. This first video can be quick because it turns out that I've given you some readings to back up some of the things I'm saying, and of course, as always, the theorists do a better job of talking about it than I do. But I want to sort of complicate a few things for you. First of all, I am going to complicate the idea of time. Obviously, narrative is important to time, and time is important to narrative. We established that in week 1. But I also want you to think about 3 things that Oscar brought up in one of his posts, and that is duration, frequency, and order. I think order might be the easiest one to think about. That matters a lot in a text, the order in which events are told and the order in which events happen. So we're talking about discourse order, but we're also talking about, probably more significantly in this case, story order. What happens now, then what happens afterwards, and then what happens as a result of that. It's extremely important in a story, because even if things aren't linked causally, close relation in time and order makes events, well, at least makes us think about cause. Another thing to think about is frequency. We use frequency, or we establish frequency even when we're using language. On Mondays, I go to, or every afternoon I tend to, or every once in a while, this is giving us some indication of frequency, and frequency is important in a story because it lets us know either that the event is extremely important or the event, on the other hand, is extremely ordinary. And then, of course, frequency, duration. Duration can be played with, how long an event takes, how short an event is. But that's, again, important to remember the difference between discourse time, the time that it takes to tell an event, and story time. And I'm going to add in something really exciting here. Umberto Eco once said that the difference between pornography and a normal movie is that in pornography, discourse time equals story time, whereas in a normal movie, discourse time is always much extended compared to story time, or it's constantly changing. So hopefully you haven't been watching a lot of pornography, so you don't know this, but according to Umberto Eco, a very noted narrative theorist, this is true. And now, awkwardly, I'm going to move on to events. And what I want you to think about with events now, and you'll have a reading about this, is that not every event is equally important in a story. So events are actions within a story or happenings within a story. So an existent, a character can do something, or something can happen to the existent. It doesn't have to be a character, it could be an object. These are events. Events make up stories. But again, not every event is equally important, and it's up to us as the reader to figure out which events matter the most. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not clear, and that's what lends some ambiguity to a text. Those events that are important and unimportant perhaps are related to satellites and kernels that Roland Barthes talks about. A kernel is an element that if it's taken out of the story is completely different. If it's a story about someone hitting a home run, obviously they have to hit that home run, or the story isn't the same. However, other events leading up to hitting the home run, or maybe I should talk about hitting a 6 in cricket. Okay, so the events leading up to that, like some guy bowls or whatever it is that you do in cricket, that might not be as important as that main event. It doesn't really matter how we get there, what other small events are in there. So those are satellites, those smaller events, versus kernels. But even events that are kernels don't have the same significance as each other. They can have different levels of significance in relation to what a story means. And then the other thing I want to think about briefly is time. Neat things happen with time other than order, duration, frequency, and that is also, so we had the order, duration, frequency. We also had the difference between discourse time and story time, things happening in the story versus how long it takes to tell an event. And I talked about that in a reply to Oscar's post. But then we also have the idea of, and now I forgot what it is, foreshadowing, backshadowing, and side shadowing. Foreshadowing is an interesting thing because I hate it when in class we talk about foreshadowing, because sometimes a narrator or an author is simply telling us something. Later in the story, after he is injured, blah, 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 and everyone says, oh, now the author foreshadowed that he's going to be injured. No, it wasn't foreshadowed, we were just told. Ideally, foreshadowing we don't really recognize until after we've come to the event that is being foreshadowed. Once we read that event and say, oh, it's a car accident, I get it. All of those references to cars earlier and some of the ominous imagery around cars earlier were foreshadowing this event. If it gets to the point where we know what's going to happen, we maybe couldn't call that foreshadowing anymore. Backshadowing is interesting because what this is when something has no significance whatsoever. There's no hint that this event will have significance. In fact, it's played down. It's clearly a satellite, clearly doesn't matter. But then later in the narrative, when something happens, we realize, oh, that earlier event that didn't seem to have any significance actually has significance, and not just as indicating what's going to happen later, but it has significance in and of itself and significance to the meaning of the story. So that's backshadowing. I think it's an interesting technique. And then there's side shadowing, and I have a reading about that in here somewhere, in which basically an author is allowing us to see alternate possibilities within a text. That at this moment in time, this character could have done X, Y, and Z, and instead decides to do Q. That those alternate possibilities, and maybe fleshing out some of those alternate possibilities, can be called side shadowing. I think we have examples of side shadowing in Bender. Some people have suggested that the narrative text, or the print text, the written text, is one of the best ways of indicating side shadowing, indicating the many possibilities open to a character or open to us. Because in film, it's really hard to show alternate realities, separate alternate realities. Of course, you could have a movie like Sliding Doors, I guess. So she gets in the subway and then one life happens, but in another version, in other parts of the movie, she didn't get into that subway and other things happen. I guess in a way that could be called complex side shadowing, although I haven't really thought about it so much, so I'm not sure if it really is. And that's it for now in an overly long video. And I'm going to stop this, and I'm actually going to create a video for later in the week. And actually, the next video is more important. So this one, you've already watched it, so you can't skip it. But I guess theoretically, you could have skipped it. And now we'll move on to the next video.